We are going to be looking at the Gilded Age, but before we look at the Gilded Age, we're just going to look at some elections that were turning points in history. One is the election of 1800. This was the one between Jefferson and Adams, and when Jefferson wins, we will see it's going to go to the House because no one truly gets the amount needed, and it will be decided to give it to Jefferson. And Jefferson, when Adams steps down and Jefferson steps up, two different people from two different parties, this election is seen as apocalyptic because of the peaceful transfer of power. The next election is the election of 1824. This is seen as the election of the common man, and we see that John Quincy Adams is running against Jackson, Clay, and Crawford, and no one wins a clear majority in the Electoral College. Because of that, it goes to the House of Representatives, and it takes from the top three. We know it's Adams, Jackson, and Crawford. Crawford has a stroke, but Clay, who was running in the election, now is in the hands of the election because he is Speaker of the House, and this is where the corrupt bargain is struck. And Adams will get the presidency, and Jackson for the next 4 years will be campaigning. So with us moving west in 1828, we're seeing our voting electorate change. Our voting electorate is becoming more common man, and in 1828, we'll see political conventions open up where people get to nominate their party, and Jackson will come to office at this time, and many people start to freak out that our government is going from the snobs to the mob because of universal manhood suffrage. We will see Jackson put people in that because of the spoil system. The election of 1860 is another turning point. We know that the Democratic Party has divided into two over Kansas, Nebraska, and also over popular sovereignty, and also over Dred Scott. We're seeing our Southern Democrats support the Dred Scott decision, which protects slavery no matter where it is. We're seeing our Northern Democrats endorse popular sovereignty. And then we have a third political group called the Republicans, who have taken from the Know-Nothings, the Free Soilers, and abolitionists, and they formed a party with no extension of slavery. Again, it's not the abolishment of slavery, it's no extension of slavery into the territories. Last one is Bell. He just wants everybody kept together, and we are going to see that the Republicans will win because the Democratic Party is split, and this will lead to the southern states seceding. 1876 is another significant election. This is the Hayes-Tyndall election. In this election, we know that Tyndall and Hayes are going to have an issue because of 3 electoral college boxes or votes from 3 southern states. An electoral commission is set up of 15 people, 9 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and the Republicans will decide to give the election to Hayes, making the Democrats feel cheated, and this is when it will lead to the Compromise of 1876, that Hayes, the Republican, will get the election, and the end of Reconstruction in the South. And so all of these amendments, which we've seen that trying to garner equality for African Americans 13th, 14th, and 15th, will be disregarded by Jim Crow laws and eventually a Supreme Court case in Plessy versus Ferguson. So for the next 100 years, African Americans are going to be disenfranchised. The election of 1896 is another important election between McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. The true issue in this election is what standard are we going to endorse for our economy? We see the Republicans under William McKinley are endorsing the gold standard, which will restrict not economic growth, but the production of paper money, because everything's based off what paper money you have is based on the amount of gold you have in your bank. William Jennings Bryan, he is going to be for our common man, and he is endorsing that we should add in silver into our money supply, which will increase the money supply, which is an inflationary practice. We're going to see that William McKinley will win. Many people freak out that we're going to have another recession, the panic that had occurred, and what will happen is we actually discover gold in Alaska. The 1912 election is a progressive election. Everyone who's running is a progressive, just a different type of form of progressive. We're going to see this is one between Taft and Roosevelt trying to vie for the Republican nomination. Taft gets it. Roosevelt gets upset, and he's going to establish the Bull Moose Party. Because the Republicans are divided up, this is going to lead to Woodrow Wilson coming in and becoming president. And again, he's a Democrat, and he has philosophies that are progressive. We're going to look at the 1932 election. This election really is a shift in our parties. We have seen that the Democrats have always believed in small government, and our Republicans have always believed in big government. Our Republicans being for business, the wealthy, and our Democrats being for the common man. Well, prior to this time period, prior to 1932, we were in a depression. And so we are going to see the Republicans have really endorsed laissez-faire. And so when Hoover's asked to do much, he doesn't do much. And so this is him endorsing small government. And so this causes Roosevelt to come out saying the government is your solution. We're going to see that he's going to create the New Deal, and that's going to create a big government. So this is when our parties follow their government style. So the Democrats will become big government, and our Republicans will become small government. Again, they endorse the same people, but we're going to see the shifting of them where they're located, because we know the South have been solidly Democratic. Eventually, in the 60s, in the latter 60s, they will shift to being Republican. The next election is 1948, and this one is the Truman election. This is Truman, and we're going to see the Democratic Party divided into three. A lot of it stems from Truman's taking on of civil rights, and the Dixiecrats will exit it, the Democratic Party, and we're going to see Wallace is going to create another party, and the Republicans are sure that Dewey would win. But what we're going to see is that Truman will get the supports of blacks, laborers, and working people, and he will win the election. The next one is the 1960 election. This one's really epochal because of the use of the television. And we're going to see this is Kennedy versus Nixon. We know that Nixon is the Republican candidate. He has more experience. He's been vice president to Eisenhower. He has had great foreign policy expertise. And Kennedy, however, he is from Massachusetts. He is in the Congress, and he has very limited experience, but he has experience. And we're going to see the TV is really going to turn the tide, because again, we listen with our eyes, and Kennedy will win the election. 1968, this is the election where LBJ decides to get out of it because of the Vietnam War. We also see that his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, is going to run. And many people are criticizing the Democratic Party for the continuation of the Vietnam War, the deception of the war. And he's running against Nixon. Nixon again is promising Vietnamization, and that will change. If I were to add another election that's really important, we could add 2000 with the Bush administration and the Electoral College debacle, and I could add in also the 2008 election. I don't know if AP is getting that far, but those would be good ones to put in there. Let's see if I have enough room to put 2008. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now what we're going to look is we're going to really look at the Gilded Age. I'm going to look at it in different themes, and we will talk about, again, what gilded means. It looks great on the outside, but when we dig in deeper, we're going to see the corruption. And this is one of the things that quantifies the conception of the Gilded Age. So first thing, we know women are upset because in Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment only gave the vote to the black man. But we are going to see some women rise up in this time period after it to campaign for that right to vote. First, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We know that they're going to form a women's organization that's going to campaign for that. They won't see it within their lifetime, but eventually at the end of this period, by the 1920s, they'll get the passage of the 19th Amendment. We're going to see Victoria Woodhull will actually run for the presidency. Again, even though she doesn't have the right to vote, the irony, she will try to run. Charlotte Perkins Gilman is going to write Women in Economics that women can work. They don't have to be stuck in this idea of the cult of domesticity, which we've been seeing since the early American Revolution. Remember, Abigail Adams asked John, remember the women, and they came back with the Republican motherhood, that it was the idea of the women in the home to educate their children in Republican values. We're still seeing that transcend into this idea down here called the cult of domesticity, that the woman's place is in the home. We're eventually going to see that we're going to have very progressive women who are advocating for rights, that their right to the home also extends beyond that to be able to protect their kids at the polls. Eventually, the Comstock laws are going to come out that restrict anything lewd and indecent from going in the mail, which really attacks Margaret Sager's efforts for birth control. Jane Addams and we see Lillian Wald are going to be people who form immigrant homes such as Hull House to help people. And again, it's social gospel. We're helping people. We're not asking for anything back. We see things like the YMCA and the Salvation Army come out at this time that are very social gospel. We're going to see that many women who do work are single, young, and poor Southern European immigrants, and they're working in the textile mills. We're going to see in the 1890s women actively participate in social groups. They're middle class. These are the people who are going to become our progressives, the army of the progressives. They're looking at politics and they're realizing that politics is forgetting the children. Politics is forgetting the consumer. Politics is forgetting the protection. And so we are going to see that women are going to say that they should get suffrage. Eventually out west, women will get suffrage in Wyoming. Many men like, why Wyoming? Why did you do this? But again, when we move out west, we're going to see women take an active role. They don't just sit in the carriage and wait for their husband to build a home. They're active and participating in building homes, building institutions, building schools. And so women out west will get the right to vote. We're going to look at immigration. Immigration is going to become the backbone for the industrial system. We're going to see our first wave of immigrants was the old immigrants from Northwestern Europe. They knew English. They knew democracy. We know that these are Germans who will have money, who will move west, and the Irish who don't have money, who will stay in the cities, who will become the industrial backbone. We're going to see that nativism will come out in that time period. The second wave of immigrants are coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. We are seeing that they are uneducated. They're the cheap work that is coming into our industrial factories. They crowd the city. This leads to anti-Semitism because many of them are Jews. This leads to nativism, xenophobia. And we're going to see we start to associate these people with radical ideas when they start campaigning for rights. And this will lead to the creation of two groups which will deal with labor. One is the Knights of Labor. These are skilled and unskilled. And yes, they're pulling from two groups, but because of that unskilled, they're not going to have much buying power. We're going to see, because of this, they will have an incident in Haymarket Square where they're rallying for greater rights, and this protest gets violent. There's going to be a bomb, and this is going to doom the Knights of Labor. However, on the other side, we have the AFL, and the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is only skilled workers, and we're going to see immigrants cannot join, and the AFL will have greater buying power because they are skilled workers. They have a trade. We're going to see immigrants, they're highly beneficial. We're going to see they provide cheap labor. They worked on the railroads, such as the Chinese and the Irish. They're going to bring diversity to our culture, new concepts. And we're going to see they're going to allow our industrial economy to become number one. Okay, the arts. We're going to see before the Civil War, we know from the War of 1812, prior to the War of 1812, we were relying on British literature, British culture, but after the War of 1812, we start to develop American culture. So we're going to see in the Civil War realistic books come out displaying what went on. And eventually this affects Mark Twain, that type of style, which y'all saw when y'all read Huckleberry Finn. Naturalism, this is like man versus nature, and Red Badge of Courage, which focused on the Civil War, focused on that. We're going to see our art. Our art had traditionally been focused on people, but we're going to see our art get our art increase and looking at displaying the distortion from society. So we get the Harmony show that displays things that typically don't go into museums, and the Ashcan School of Art, which is the more dark and decrepit stuff of art. And we get modern art with Cubism, with Pablo Picasso. Eventually in the Depression, we get people like Diego Rivera that promoted the huge murals. And we also get literature of the Depression, which we see with John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And eventually by the 1960s, we get pop art like Andy Warhol and Jackson Pollock, if you've seen them before. Okay, what we're going to look at is African Americans. I've discussed a little bit of African Americans if you saw the Reconstruction one, review 7. But we know the 13th Amendment basically established and abolished slavery, the idea. But we know that that will be overturned during Reconstruction with the establishment of black codes, and this is going to lead to a tougher Reconstruction plan, and eventually they get rid of the black codes. But at the end of Reconstruction, when it's over, Jim Crow laws will be passed. We know the 14th Amendment is supposed to establish equality of all Americans born within the United States. And anytime there's a violation of that, Congress is supposed to come up. And we know Congress won't really do that. The 15th Amendment allows for the passage of voting rights for African Americans. I told you the black codes during Reconstruction are going to be passed, and we're going to see the KKK rise up, and this is going to signal to Congress that there's going to be true difficulty in creating racial equality. We're going to see during this time of Reconstruction that African Americans will gain people in office. We're going to see scalawags from the South and carpetbaggers from the North come in and do legislation to help. We're going to see after Reconstruction's over, the Redeemers do come back. And we're going to see most of the reforms that we've done in the South, such as education and infrastructure and helping African Americans, will be overturned. But during the time of the Civil War, we're going to see the Republican Party establish the Homestead Act that allowed for people to move west and obtain 160 acres. Many African Americans will move west and obtain that 160 acres. Many African Americans will join the army, becoming our Buffalo Soldiers. And again, they're called Buffalo Soldiers because of their hair, and when many people encounter the buffalo, they're going to have that similarity. Others will become tenant farmers or sharecroppers, and they'll stay in the South, and this is going to lead to that dependency on the same type of labor that they had done before and be perpetually in debt. We're going to see the Redeemers create the Jim Crow laws that will last all the way up to the 1960s, and this is what the Civil Rights Movement is fighting. We'll see these Jim Crow laws are allowed to stay on the books because of a case, Plessy versus Ferguson. We know Homer Plessy is trying to get on a railroad cart. He is 1/8 black, and the Supreme Court, they don't specifically say separate but equal, but they said that as long as they're adhering to the 14th Amendment, separation could occur. And so this is when we see the separate but equal facilities created. We know they're separate but not inherently equal. Two of the people who will take on the civil rights movement after Reconstruction, one is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington wants African Americans to get a vocational training. And he says if they get a vocational training, this will give them economic rights first. And then once they get that money in their pocket, they could then demand their political. We will see he create Tuskegee Institute. He doesn't create it, but he's one of the leading founders of it. And he will go into this and he will develop this whole idea that African Americans should get vocational training. And he basically is appeasing many of the white social structures that is accepted at this time. Webb, however, on the other hand, he really wants this whole thing with the Niagara movement, that the talented tenth of the African American population get educated. And they get educated and they come back and they change their economy. And he's really challenging the social structure. We're going to see that he wants to have immediate use of the 15th Amendment, and this is what's going to lead to the creation of the NAACP. We're going to see Webb is actually challenging the social structure of what the South means. So many people are going to resist Webb in the South. Eventually, by the 1920s, many African Americans realize that equality is really hard in America. And Marcus Garvey is going to introduce the Back to Africa movement. He creates the United Negro Improvement Association to generate businesses and support for the African American community. What we're going to look at is the philosophy of the Gilded Age. Social Darwinism is something that will transcend into imperialism as the survival of the fittest. And we're going to see that this is going to mainly influence the end of Reconstruction, because many people say African Americans have the right to vote. Let them do it on their own. And this is the philosophy that only the strong should survive. There should be no help for the poor. And the government shouldn't come out. We will see this eventually be endorsed by Rockefeller. However, on the other side is this idea of gospel of wealth that Carnegie endorses, that it is the task of the wealthy man to be the trust in for his poor brethren, and that they should create ladders of success, provide them opportunities so that they can move up in society. And one of the things that he'll do is the establishment of libraries. Other things is Carnegie Hall. He's going to establish an endowment for Carnegie Mellon. And so we're going to see it's only for those who are going to use it. He's just not giving it to everybody. The last one is social gospel. This is giving aid to anybody who needs aid and not requiring anything back. So it's the most extreme. It's the opposite of social Darwinism. Social gospel of wealth is in the middle because it requires those who are going to use it to do something with it. Social gospel is just giving out aid. This is the YMCA, Salvation Army, Hull House, the immigrant home movement. So the other thing in religion is we're going to have this real divide between fundamentalism, who believe the literal interpretation of the Bible, and the modernists that believe that you could take religion and also adopt scientific principle. And this will eventually lead to the Scopes monkey trials, which we'll see in the 1920s. We will see, and then the Church of Christian Science, which Christianity Heals with Mary Baker Eddy. So in the economy, the railroad is going to be financed through land grants. The government will come in and give these railroad companies the land, and they're able to use that land as collateral to get loans. We're going to see the government will provide subsidies, and so the government is funding the railroad, and the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific will get land grants and be able to finance their operations. We're going to see monopolies will be synonymous with the Gilded Age, and we know that there is holding companies, that it's a parent company that has the major shares of smaller companies. We will see trust, which is like the sugar trust. It's all these small farmers coming together to create a monopoly so they eliminate competition and they could increase price. We saw this with the oatmeal trust. We see this with Standard Oil. There's two different things between a vertical and horizontal combination. A vertical combination means they own every single step in the process to make one good. We know Carnegie does this with steel. He owns a steel plant. He owns the coal mines. He owns the railroads. And so that allows him to eliminate the middleman and keep profit high. Horizontal combinations, this is exactly what Rockefeller did with Standard Oil. He combined in the same industry. So, JP Morgan will eventually buy Carnegie Steel, and we know JP Morgan is one of the big financiers of this time. Vanderbilt deals with the railroad. He's not on there, but eventually labor unions will begin to challenge their employers, asking for greater pay, asking for improved working conditions, asking for shorter days. We're going to see the Knights of Labor fail. The AFL will be a little bit more successful. The Sherman Antitrust Act is going to be created, and it's supposed to take down trusts that are involved in interstate commerce. Again, it's not going to be used against trust at this time. It's going to be used to break up strikes, such as the Pullman strike. The Pullman strike had taken over the railroads in Chicago, and this led the courts issuing injunctions to break up the strike. And eventually, we'll see the Clayton Antitrust Act be the one that exempts labor from being counted as a monopoly. As we move west, we're known the populist movement is going to gain wind. The populist movement is trying to get a government that is represented by the people, and we're going to see they want greater progressive ideas such as recall, initiative, referendum, a graduated income tax. We're going to see that they also want the direct election of senators, but the real election of 1896 focused on gold and silver. We know William Jennings Bryan will lose, but a lot of his ideas of the populist movement will eventually affect our progressives. So we're going to look at politics at this time. We're going to see Democrats and Republicans kind of seem similar on the issues, but they vote the way they shot. So that's what the bloody shirt means. You vote if you shot for the Union, you vote for the Republicans. If you shot for the Confederacy, you vote for the Democrats. We're going to see our senators are elected by the state legislature, and many people feel that these people don't reflect what their constituents want, that they're nicknamed the Millionaires Club because they're being bought by big interest. And eventually this is why the populists want to introduce the 17th Amendment. We're going to see cities are going to be run by political machines such as Boss Tweed, and these people are like the go-betweens between the politician and the constituents. The political machine goes out and they actively campaign to get votes and the immigrants from the immigrants, and the immigrants will vote the way that they need. Andrew Johnson, there will be an impeachment because he violates the Tenure of Office Act, where he removes someone without the consent of the Senate. The impeachment process will go. They come one short, so he's acquitted. We're seeing the Grant administration, he has the issue with the credit mobilier scandal, where the railroad has hired a construction company, which the people who are in charge of the railroad are also in charge of the construction company. So they're pocketing the money, and they're causing the cost of it to increase. I already talked about the Hayes-Tyndall election, where Hayes wins at the expense of Tyndall, and we see this leads to the Compromise of 1877, where Hayes wins and Reconstruction, military reconstruction's over in the South, and we will forget about securing the rights of African Americans. The next election actually deals with the spoils system. Garfield is a stalwart. He believes that Garfield is a half-breed, He believes that jobs should only be given out to the most qualified. Arthur is a stalwart, and a stalwart means spoils. They believe in the spoil system. Garfield does not give a job to a guy who's trying to get it, and he's like, oh my gosh, how do I get this job? And he eventually assassinates Garfield. This signals to Arthur that we need to do some civil service reform, and this will lead to the Pendleton Civil Service Act that requires anybody that is getting a job in the federal government, from the Postal Service to the IRS agent to the Border Security, have to take a test to pass, and they won't be getting the job unless they do well on that test. The next election is the Cleveland election, and this is when we have mudslinging about Cleveland having an illegitimate child, and eventually Cleveland will win despite that. The Dawes Act is passed at this time, where we're going to give Native Americans 160 acres, and the whole purpose of that is to break up their households, and that we're breaking up the tribe. We also know that we're taking away their kids at this time. And this is going to lead to a reduction of Native American lands, which will allow people to move west. The Interstate Commerce Act is created at this time, and it's huge because this is the first time the government is trying to regulate big business. It's the end of laissez-faire. The Pension Act is created. He will veto it, but it will pass, where we're going to give pensions to veterans, and they lower the tariff. This will lead to the Harrison election, where he's dealing with the $1 billion Congress, and they purchased up Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which is going to cause chaos in our next panic because we have too much silver creating too much money. The McKinley tariff, which is a high tariff. The Sherman Antitrust Act is passed, which is supposed to regulate business, and the Pension Act is passed, which is giving veterans. Homestead steel strike occurs, and this is when people of Andrew Carnegie's steel plant are protesting for higher wages, and they lock down the steel plant so they can have a sit-in, and the Pinkertons are brought in, and this will lead to a decline of the steel labor union having power. In 1892, Cleveland wins again, but we are seeing we're in a depression or a decline, and the Panic of 1893. We see that Coxey's army is going to march on the Capitol asking for their Civil War bonuses to begin. They're not paid. We repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act because we realized that was the cause of the panic. Shrinks our money supply, and J.P. Morgan at this time will bail out. Then we get the Pullman strike. I talked about this before. They're taking over the railroads. The Sherman Antitrust Act is used against this labor union because they're acting like a monopoly, and the strike ends. The last election is 1896. I already talked about this with William McKinley for the Republicans for big business that are proponents of the gold standard, and William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats and the Populists that are for the silver. And they're for a lot of other reforms: graduated income tax, direct election of senators, initiative referendum recall. And we were going to see that McKinley wins, but with the discovery of gold in Alaska solves our monetary problems, and we don't go into an economic crisis. We're done with the Gilded Age.